Hi, this is Mike Croissant, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
Yeah, this is a lot of fun. I've got my buddy Ron up here. Ron also writes books, his grassroots histories, that kind of thing. And Mike has done the same thing. He's written a book. Well, I guess what I'll do is I'll have you just introduce the book, but it's a World War II themed book. Tell us a little more about it, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Bombing Hitler's Hometown was published on March 26th after about 13 years in development. It's the story of the last mass bomber raid of World War II in Europe. It's essentially the story of the 15th Air Force's raid on Linz, Austria, and took place on April 25th, 1945. Up to that point, for the previous 2 weeks or so, the 15th Air Force, which was the U.S. Strategic Air Force based in Italy, had been striking targets largely inside Italy, tactical targets, specifically associated with the German army, which was retreating up the boot of Italy. And because of that, they faced little resistance. So when the men were rousted out of bed before dawn on April 25th, told they were going to Linz, many were apoplectic because they knew Linz was such a terrible target for them. And when they learned that morning, that Linz would be even more heavily defended than normal, many men were quite upset. And the extra anti-aircraft guns that the Germans were able to withdraw from Vienna before it fell to the Soviets were placed in Linz. So the men faced a shooting, the men were in a shooting gallery. So on this last great raid, bombers and men were shot to pieces. So it's the story of the last raid. Linz, though a military target on this day and every other time that we bombed it, was also symbolically important because it was the town that Adolf Hitler considered home. And what I mean by that is Adolf Hitler was about 9 years old when his family moved to a suburb of Linz. And for the next 9 or 10 years, the family lived in or near the city. Linz being the third largest city in Austria, both then and now. Then it was a population of about 65,000, and today about 200,000. And some formative events happened in Adolf's life while he lived there. He lost both of his parents. He lost his baby brother. And he was first exposed to German nationalist ideas there. So between all of that and going through adolescence, it was an important time in his life. And, perhaps some things happened there that started him down the path that he eventually went down. So that in a nutshell is the story. The story is about the last great raid on Linz, Austria, and it follows the men in the bombers, and after they're shot down, 28 men lost their lives and 15 planes were shot down. Many more were wounded. It's the story of the mission and how the men got back to base and then later resumed their lives. That's it in a nutshell.
Ron?
Yeah, I have a lot. I have a lot on my mind. I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you, Mike, is just for everybody watching and listening. Can you kind of put into context the military and historic importance of this raid?
Sure. The war, as we all know, was winding down. Even the men knew it at the time, though. Of course, hindsight is 2020. They knew the war would be over soon, and they didn't want to die. They wanted to finish the war with their heads held high, but of course didn't want to be the last man to die. They went up and had a very rough time, but in retrospect, the raid was significant because it was the last time during World War II, in Europe at least, that the U.S. sent an entire strategic air force after an individual target. For a couple of days after this, both the 15th in Italy and the 8th Air Force in England would send individual bomb groups after individual targets. But this is the last time in Europe that an entire force would be sent after one target. A huge raid, 500 bombers and 200 escort fighters. So big numbers. We're talking almost 16,000 airmen, American airmen up in the air fighting for their lives.
Wow.
So, by earlier standards in the war, it wasn't the largest raid, but it certainly was a big one. And of course, we all know that, the era of the heavy bomber would soon end. So there would be nothing like this again over Europe. And now, of course, we're in the age of drones and electronic warfare and everything else. So it was truly
Right.
the end of an era, both militarily and historically.
There was something that really jumped out at me. I wanted to ask you about this later, but about the voices of the men themselves. But I wanted to hold off on that for a minute. There was a guy that you met. I wish you could retell the story because it brought chills down my spine. Aerial gunman Jack Linsfield. You met him in New Orleans, and the way the story went, you can pick it up from there. But I know you picked up a napkin, and tell me about that one because that's
I did. Every writer has to have a napkin and a pen on hand in case you get an idea to jot down. So, I had spoken to Jack a few times on the phone. He was a gunner on a B-17. And by the way, the 15th Air Force was primarily a B-24 Liberator outfit. About 2/3 of the force was B-24s. The other third was B-17 Flying Fortresses. The 8th Air Force, that ratio was roughly reversed. It was primarily B-17s. So anyway, B-17, Jack Linsfield is on one. He's got a few missions left to go. At that time, if you survived 35 combat missions, you could go home.
Wow.
And Jack was getting near the end. He had been to Berlin the previous month, which was the largest escorted bomber raid during the war.
wow.
And he's a seasoned veteran, and he makes it through the day okay, but he was just one of the 55 or so guys that I was able to locate and interview.
Wow.
So I eventually met Jack in New Orleans. I went there. It was actually 10 years ago this spring. And we met in a nice restaurant that Jack frequently dined at. And we're sitting there having, I think, an early lunch or a late breakfast. And we're just chatting. And I pull out a napkin and a pen and I jot down, I make little X marks on the napkin, just a few initially. And I say, so if this is a light barrage of flak, then I add a few more. And this is a medium barrage of flak. What was it like over Linz that day? And it was spine chilling. He looks at me with look like he's looking right through me back into the mists of time or something. It's hard to describe, but he turns and there's a pillar next to his chair and the trim on the pillar is solid black. So he turns and he points right at the solid black. And the meaning, for those of us who can envision what I'm talking about, the Germans would shoot up with anti-aircraft guns, artillery shells, and these would burst in a puff of black smoke. And then shrapnel, hot chunks of jagged metal would shoot in all directions. And these, this was in the age before guided missiles. So the exploding shrapnel would strike the thin-skinned bombers, and ideally in German eyes would throw enough of them off course that it would disrupt the bombing pattern and spare the target at least some of the damage. So Jack's unspoken meaning was that there were so many of these explosions of anti-aircraft artillery shells that it turned the sky black. And that was something many of the men told me, but never in such a way. It just absolutely gave me goosebumps. And I could see in his eyes that he was seeing it as if it had just happened.
Yeah. The portrayal of that in the book just brought me chills. It really did. I mean,
there are many moments like that, and one of the men who really started me down the journey to writing the book, in addition to my uncle, who I'm sure we'll talk about later, but His name was John Dominy. His nickname was Duck because he could imitate Donald Duck. John was a ball turret gunner on a B-24, pretty far up at the front of the formation. And he didn't need to be there. The previous night, the man before him in the line for the shower had used up all the hot water. So John got under the cold water, and in his haste, he slipped and fell because the floor was slippery from slope, and he injured his shoulder. And one of the places you don't want to be with an injured shoulder is the ball turret on a B-24. It's just cramped, spherical turret underneath the bomber with, ammunition boxes and all of the equipment and the stuff the guy's wearing, the heated suit. It's all crammed into this little tiny ball. And so Duck goes on the mission anyway because he wants to finish the war with his buddies. He's down in his turret, scanning the sky for German fighters, and the nose gunner calls out over the intercom, flak 12 o'clock level. That means right in front of the bomber, there's a bunch of flak, one of these black clouds that I described. So Duck rotates his turret to look forward, and he would later write, "I knew that I was going to die. The flak was like a solid wall." And that was another moment that really gave me the chills, and I would go on to interview John and a couple of his crewmates. They, within a few minutes of him seeing that, they were shot down and captured. So, and I found that to be the most vivid memory of all the men, all the 55 men or so that I interviewed. It was the flak, and they remembered it like it was, still popping off in front of them, and it deeply impacted them. Many of the men couldn't go to 4th of July fireworks after coming home because of what they faced that day. It just reminded them too much of what they went through.
I want to jump in here because we talk about flak and black smoke and shells, but let's understand what this is, right? You're flying in an aluminum skinned, maybe lightly armored airplane. There's a bomb going off somewhere near you. That bomb has, depending on what the ordnance is, maybe, I don't know, maybe a 1/4 inch of metal, maybe 1/2 inch of metal, blown, molten hot, spinning on 3 axes. Maybe it weighs 1.5 pounds. Maybe it weighs as much as a marble, but it's all coming at you in various directions at a plus of 2,000 feet per second. Right. And so when we say flak, we're talking about that. Like, imagine how close you'd want to be near a bomb and how quickly your life would flash before your eyes. I was, and this is not about me, but I'm just trying to give you some context here. I was routinely mortared when I lived in Mosul. And one of the days you heard the boom. But now flak is really just mortars in the sky. That's the best way to think about it. Boom, it goes off. Boom, it goes off. I'm in the gas of my Toyota Land Cruiser. It's a diesel. There's people running across the street, all trying to get to shelters, right? We don't have anywhere to go, right? Because you're just out in the open. And I know, by the way, the 3 shells are coming, because I know there's a third one, there always was, that it was going to hit right where we were going to be. And so now you have to picture my Land Cruiser as an airplane. And so we just kind of scrunch down, and then boom, and it blows the back driver's side all the way back, as far back from me as it could be, all those windows out. And one of the pieces of metal went through the fender, through all the interior stuff, hit the bottle jack in our car, and sprayed bottle jack oil everywhere. Didn't get me, didn't get my compadre, but that is sort of what you're talking about. Something that, if you don't know what a bottle jack is, look it up. You'll get an idea. It's not a delicate little thing. It's one of the most robust things in a car. So just when we talk about flak, we're talking about something that is terrifying. I would never want to be that close to a mortar again. And then that was the one, right? Like, okay, so a couple go off, but if I was flying to mission, it was series of those. I mean, it's heart attack material. So I just wanted to jump in and say that, and then let either one of you respond from there.
Right. And this day in particular, the photo reconnaissance missions prior to this day had shown that the men would be facing 164 anti-aircraft artillery guns. The last time that they had gone to Linz, it was 110. So we're talking half again as many. And even before that, Linz was a terrible target. So they were in a shooting gallery, and like I said, this was the time before guided missiles. So the idea was that the Germans would aim these 164 guns into a specific point in the sky, and they would fill a cube-shaped box 2,000 feet wide, 2,000 feet high, and 2,000 feet deep with exploding flak. And it would be, they knew the altitude and speed at which the men were coming, so they filled the sky at a certain point right before bomb release with this exploding metal. And the idea would be, like I said, to disrupt the formation and therefore disrupt the bombing pattern. And on our side, the men couldn't take evasive action. You know, on the bomb run, the bombardier and the pilot are working together. The plane where it needs to be. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm getting stuck or if you're getting stuck, but the Wi-Fi is acting a little buggy on somewhere in the middle. But
yeah, he's
I was hearing
pausing
most
up
of
on
it.
me. Yeah, pausing up on me there. Can you hear us, Mike?
I can't hear Mike either. Yeah. Well, Ron, let's see. Oh, wait, hold on. Is Mike back? I think Mike.
Yeah,
back.
Mike's back.
Mike, are you back? Maybe not. Oh man, Wi-Fi is such a bugaboo.
Yeah.
But Ron, when he's talking about when he's talking about all this, when you're thinking as an author, what how do you describe this? How do you describe flak? How do you describe that fear when you've got these first person accounts?
Well, here's the thing that I was thinking. You know, I've written books, of course, that you know, where people are all dead. You know, the Battle of the Alamo. So I'm doing all the research of dead people. You know, and I'm trying to piece together what happened. And it's a beautiful thing when you actually have people that you can interview that are still alive. And that was the one thing I would love to ask him about, because you know, I remember, and I think I've told you this story, Pete, but it was a privilege to interview people that were landed on Normandy, the last Comanche code talker, you know, Mr. Carter, who was Lloyd Carter, who was a USS Indianapolis survivor. Right. Can you hear me, Mike?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Good.
I wanted to ask you about, I've interviewed a lot of World War II veterans who were at Pearl Harbor and Normandy, and a gentleman named Lloyd Carter. He was a survivor on the USS Indianapolis. And I got a chance to interview him. And what I remember, and this reminded me of your stories, is when he talked about the moment he had to jump in the water knowing that the ship was going down. I'll never forget the glaze in his eyes. He was looking through me. He was back on that ship as a kid, jumping into the open ocean and swimming for his life. And it was chilling to me. And what I was telling Pete was that I really wanted to ask you about the opportunity to be able to talk to survivor, you know, eyewitnesses. Can you expand on that a little?
He cannot, because he fell off the.
Oh shoot!
That's all right. We're
well,
going
to
we'll keep going. Yeah, when you write a book like this, obviously, and you have the ability to talk to what's left of the World War II veterans, and you and I come from a place where the USS Indy has one of its last living survivor, you know, and it's remarkable to hear Harold Braze's name, hear Harold talk about his very clear memories of all of this, you know, because it happened and a lot of it just gets burned into your brain. But one of the crazy things about Harold Braze, again, Harold Braze survives the sinking of the Indianapolis and the 5-day ordeal of being lost at sea. Right. He comes back and the Navy's like, where do you want to go? He's like, nowhere near the ocean. And so they send him to Great Lakes, which sounds like it's near a lake, and it is, but they're not doing naval stuff there. He was doing training, but he never told his folks. And that is something about that generation where they didn't want to make a big deal about what they did, because so many people did so much more and lost so much more. So they were, these are the depression kids that are like, we've already seen hard things. I'm not going to bellyache about what I had, to the point where he didn't tell his folks. He's in what turned out to be the most famous, maybe second most famous sunken ship in America's history for World War II.
Yeah. I wanted to commend Mike for 55 eyewitnesses to be able to talk and interview him on some level. That's historically important, because they're almost all gone now. In those World War II veterans, there's only a handful left.
Yeah, I've been studying my grandfather's time as a pilot in World War II. He was a fighter pilot. He flew Hellcats. And there's a very small slice of time where, and really it's months. You could say years, but it's like 36 months, probably less than that, where you could actually get into an airplane and be over somewhere, and then that door just shuts and they stop training those guys because they've got what they need. And so it's a snapshot within a film of this history, and the ability to actually put yourself in a plane over Linz. There's a lot of dudes there, but there are so many that never did and never would have gotten the chance, and maybe even trained up to the point of deployment. But it was like, no, never mind, stay here and help us do other stuff. So that history is very, not only perishable now that people are dying, but there's only, like, if you were born in 1915, you probably weren't going to get into that airplane. You'd be doing something else. And if you were born in 1943, you're probably not getting into that airplane. So there's like a very small time for time. It's tighter than what I'm doing even too. Like if you're born in 1922, I probably should say, you probably aren't getting into that airplane. Hey, Mike, welcome back. Hopefully we'll have a solid connection.
Mike, I wanted to ask you, if I may.
Apologize.
No,
That's
all
right.
good. I want to commend you for 55 eyewitnesses. I mean, that's phenomenal. It's historically important to be able to document those. Can you just kind of tell us a little bit about that, and the importance of being able to sit down with somebody and look in their eyes when you're talking about this?
Sure. It was, looking back, I'm going to definitely consider that, a high point in life, being able to do that. Essentially what I did was in my research, in unit histories and newsletters and archives, the National Archives, I would get lists of men on the mission, and using whitepages.com, I would find as many of the men as I could. And because they were a generation that wrote letters, I would write a letter, tell them what I was up to, and ask them to call me. And I probably received about a 50% response rate.
Wow.
Which was remarkable. These guys, when I started, were all in their late 80s. And unfortunately, I just lost the last man that I was in regular contact with about a year ago. But anyway, we would typically have an interview on the telephone. Some men had little to say, had something to say, but not a lot. But then you would have a man who was ready to go, ready to talk about it. A couple of them told me they'd never told anyone the story before other than close family. And that's pretty remarkable. Many of the men were never the same again after that day, and took their memories and locked them away in their minds. A couple of men told me that. And I know it took some time to develop trust with a couple of them. And once I've had that trust, we went to some pretty extraordinary places together. And I think of Hal Millett, who was another ball turret gunner. He was on a B-17, certifiable genius with an IQ of 160, also an atheist. So he would spend his time in the ball turret thinking through worst case scenarios. His approach to getting through the war was to think his way through it. So he would go down a list of worst case scenarios and then try to come up with a solution. Like, what if I lose my oxygen connection? What if I'm hit and I can't control the bleeding, et cetera, et cetera. And he came home made it through the war without a scratch, came home and started to have symptoms of what we would now call PTSD. And at one point, it got so bad, he battled alcoholism as well. It got so bad that he described to me, he was a computer guy, so he described it as taking his memories and sequestering them on a part of a computer hard drive that was not easy to access. And not quite throwing away the key, but come pretty close. He went so far as to even forgetting the names, or at least the full names, of many of his crewmates. So that was pretty extreme. And it took the intervention of his daughter in the 1990s to get him to start opening the door. And it was really hard for him. He had really locked that stuff away down deep. And the surviving crew members had a reunion in 2002. And he found that many of them had the same thing. They just couldn't remember large chunks of things. He saw that as a defensive mechanism. So they went through several days together of a reunion, and Hal got home and he had a sort of an emotional breakdown because it all suddenly came flowing back.
Wow.
So I caught him in the twilight years of his life, spent a lot of time on the phone and in person. And I spoke with him in the final days of his life as well. I called him and he was in the hospital. And I could tell he was regaling presumably the nurses in the background with tales from the war. And it was nice to see my friend had seemingly found peace. But hopefully they all found it, but I'm sure some did not. And that's just unfortunate.
It's interesting you mentioned him, because I wrote his name down about the movie theater episode when he came back home. If you could tell us that one, that's a
sure.
just with these
the movie 12 O'Clock High, I think, came out in 1949. It was a black and white film, and it did have a couple of sequences that were, for that time period at least, pretty edgy, pretty realistic, including the functioning of a ball turret, combat scenes of bombers from the 8th Air Force. And Hal started to shake uncontrollably and sweat. So he left the theater in the middle of the movie, and waited in the lobby for his wife. And she came out and asked him what's wrong. And he said, I just can't handle it. And he would never again view another movie about World War II aerial combat.
Wow. Yeah. And that's one story, and all these guys that came back with those kinds of stories. That Mr. Carter I was mentioning, guys that survived the USS Indianapolis, I was the first person that he'd ever talked to. I mean, he never went to reunions. He hardly even talked to his family. And so I think that was probably more common than we would think,
It was. The family members of the men that I've spoken with have said the same. And I've been on almost a book tour. That's probably overstating it, but doing author events the last couple of weeks all around the country, and it's almost universal. My dad, my grandpa, my uncle never talked about it. So people are turning to me for information about what their loved ones did, which is remarkable. And I kind of knew going in that it would be that way, and I wrote the book not only as a love letter to the men, but to the children and relatives as well, because they deserve to know at least something of what their loved ones went through, and why they couldn't talk about it.
Right. I have something I wanted to throw out, probably for both of you guys, but Mike, I was talking to somebody today, a friend of mine. We were talking about history, and then I was thinking about all the people I'd interviewed that were in World War II and all these different historic events now, and they're all gone, and there's only a little bit left. I'm kind of curious what you think. I mean, documenting something like this to me is profoundly important, because these guys are gone now. How do you think future generations are going to look at, because these future generations haven't grown up with men like this and women like, that were in the war, and grandfathers and great grandfathers and that. How do you kind of view this story going forward? How will it be remembered?
Well, I think World War II is one of those few examples of a war where it's very unambiguous, where where the two sides or the sides in the story sit. There's a good, and then there's evil. With the Soviets being allied with the good. So I personally think that they were evil. And if you read the parts about Dale Shabilsky, who was an airman who was tortured by the Soviets when he gave himself up to them, there's a part of the Russians. I don't know how to describe it, but there's a dark side to many Russians, and it was true then. It's been true throughout history, and the people of Ukraine are seeing that now. But anyway, World War II, I think there is no such thing as a good war, but if there was, it would come pretty close to being that. So my hope is people will read my books, similar books, and see films like Saving Private Ryan, and remember that what these men did was truly extraordinary. And when they came home, they asked almost nothing in return. Many men took the government up on the offer of the GI Bill, got an education that way, and that's pretty much all that they took. There were no handouts for these guys. Then they earned it, and they were very humble, and that's what I take most from talking to so many of the men: the humility, the selflessness, the courage, and then just wanting to get on with their lives when it was over. Really remarkable.
Yeah.
Is your uncle's story what drove you to this book?
It's what started me down the path to telling a story, not necessarily this story. I didn't know my uncle. He went through this mission and the war without a scratch. 21 combat missions. Finished the war, served very honorably. Did an extremely good job of bombing on this day. I have documents to prove it. He was a bombardier. He came home with his crew. They flew back on an old B-24 called the Consolidated Mess. They were waiting to be discharged. He planned to go to the University of Illinois, which is incredibly my alma mater, to study agriculture when he was done. He was waiting to be discharged in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Our family is from Illinois. He was given a chance to hop on a transport plane to Madison, Wisconsin, and he would then travel onward to Illinois. That plane crashed, and all aboard were killed. My family was never given a satisfactory answer from the Army about why that happened, so I took it on myself in 2007 to carry on sort of an investigation of my own using records and the crash report from that time. I did so, and what I found was that essentially there was bad weather. There was a co-pilot flying on his own. He had no co-pilot, and one particular instrument that was critical for flying in bad weather was inoperable. So the plane crashed and killed everyone on board. So my uncle's life was snuffed out at age 22, just a few weeks after the war ended.
Wow.
So as I got curious about him, he and my dad were very close. They were only 13 months apart, two of 8 children. I got my dad talking about it in my dad's final years. I got my aunts, my uncle's sisters, of course, to open up about it. I got my uncle's wartime letters, and I used the letters to piece together most of the combat missions he went on. And as I approached those, I would, I was a CIA analyst at the time. I would approach it analytically. Why did we bomb this target on this day? Is there anything significant historically, culturally, or whatnot about the target, et cetera, et cetera? So I'm going down the list, and I come to Linz, Austria. Well, I didn't know it. I think probably many of the people who bought the book didn't know it, but it's Hitler's hometown. So that grabbed my attention. And then doing internet searches, I came across the accounts of people like John Dominy. John said again, I knew that I was going to die. There were many accounts like it out there at the time. And for me, it went very quickly from I could write a book about this to I have to write a book about this. So in 2012, I started to put words to paper. I finished the main combat narrative within a couple of years. I was given access to a lot of things that had never been published, like memoirs, diary entries, letters, and supplementing that with records from the government. I was able to put together a pretty complete account of what happened, especially on the bombers that were shot down, 15 bombers down. I talked to men on 6 of those, and I have firsthand accounts from every other one, which is incredible when you think about it, almost 8 decades later. So my writing is such that I try to put you in the cockpit or in the ball turret or wherever on the airplane as it's going over the target and as you're taking heavy fire, and for a great number of men as you're bailing out. And many of the men were also shot at from the ground by Germans. So it's intense. It's not a book I think you'd want to read right before bed, but it's very cinematic, and it's meant to make you feel as much as possible, for someone never having experienced combat before, to make you feel like you're there.
Yeah. I write in a nonfiction narrative style. It's all, everything's footnoted, primary sources and all that. But yeah, you did an outstanding job I did feel there. I felt right there. I felt the chills, and what really elevated everything for me, because I love to write, but man, you had voices. You had the voices of the men, and you just, when people are talking about things that are emotional to them, and it's the best kind of writing there is, because people are speaking from the heart.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I wondered what you thought of that, because the voices are so powerful. The quotes are so powerful.
It is, and I returned to John Dominy. His crew, they called themselves the Roger the Lodger crew. The Roger the Lodger is a somewhat naughty limerick that I won't repeat here, but for some reason that really attached to them. They named their plane Roger the Lodger, and though they weren't flying that plane that day, they were very close, and they stayed close after the war. A couple of the men were wounded, nearly died, but they all made it. They stayed close, and they had a reunion in 1988. The surviving members, I think there was 5 of them, maybe 6. And fortunately, the co-pilot, Fred Funk, recorded it, or at least much of it. So I have hours and hours of audio of the men just telling their perspective on what happened that day. They all bailed out. They were all but 1 were captured by the Germans. 2 were grievously wounded on the ground.
Wow.
So just listening to the men in their own voices and letting me capture their personalities, it was truly incredible. And I would later, in retirement, once I had the book deal, I made a trailer, like a movie trailer, but for a book. And I used some of the actual recordings. The voices
awesome.
You'll hear on that trailer are the men.
Yeah.
Straight from the book. So it was a blessing to, have this responsibility for telling the story, and to have so many family members help me by giving me these audio tapes and giving me the letters and the diaries and everything.
You knew it in the moment when you were collecting this stuff that this has to be a book. I've got to finish this now. This is, I could tell.
Right. And then, I reached a certain point where I felt like I had a pretty good feel for a complete version of the American side. And I wanted to do what I could to at least have some Austrian perspectives. The Austrians, you could debate, the Austrian role in the war, but the people on the ground were mostly innocent. There are a few true villains on the Austrian side in the book, but I went over to Austria, to Linz twice, 2012 and 2019, to see the town, to visit some of the sites, and to interview people. And I talked to several, I think 5 people who were under the bombs that day and on other days. I talked to wonderful lady named Anna who was 5 years old. She would describe how the air raid sirens would go off. She would walk home from kindergarten holding the hand of her best friend and take shelter in the apartment building's basement. She described how the single light bulb was dangling from a wire and it would shake when the bombs hit and dust would fall. Pretty incredible stuff. And another young man both of his parents were deaf. So when the sirens went off, it fell to him to take them to the nearest shelter. Just, a lot of times I had to almost pinch myself. I can't believe this is happening. But, I felt the duty to include at least some of the Austrian side in the book as well. And I think a lot of people will come away from it glad that I did so.
Absolutely. Yeah, it gives a fuller picture. It almost feels fated, that you got to these people in time. I mean, really before the door shut, that's the way it feels to me. Like this whole thing was fated to unfold this way.
Hey, I just want to show everybody down below is the link for the book. You can look in the remarks, whether they're over there, and you guys should definitely buy the book. It's fantastic. Ron and I have both been through it, and look, we're talking to Mike Bowen because he's a friend, but two, he's written this thing that's historically important. And if you're at all interested, or people in your family interested in World War II history, this is a story that basically no one else has told, and now really can't tell ever again better than what Mike has done because of his capability as a writer, as a researcher, and as an analyst. And so I always say, buddy read, buy 2 copies, get one for you, get one for your friend, and read it. That's how you support people like Mike. You can use the Amazon link, which I'm going to put back up on the screen here. There's the Amazon link right there. You can use that, or look in the show notes. It'll be in there, or just get it wherever you get books. And I know you're going to love this thing because World War II history is fascinating, and this book has real emotions in it. All right, so Ron, go ahead. You want to ask your question? I kind of cut you off there just to do some work.
No, that's fine. I wanted to ask you about being a CIA analyst and how you felt that helped with the research on this book. And I like the way you said you applied your analytics to the dates that bombs came in and all that. I mean, you're doing a deep dive on all these dates and everything. Just tell me about that.
Sure. Well, being a researcher and a writer is part of being a CIA analyst. That's the bread and butter of what an analyst does. An analyst is charged with informing the American policymaker about current events or about strategic challenges, strategic opportunities, warning about forthcoming possible attacks or invasions or whatnot. And the mandate is global, so you have to be on your toes, and you have to have a mind that's open to a lot of different possibilities. So with taking these skills over the course of my career, I probably wrote literally thousands of pages of reports or operational cables or whatnot. So that would be my day job, and I would come home at night and talk to wonderful aged veterans and then put their story to paper. So the types of writing, unfortunately, were very different. The analytical style is meant to convey complex issues in the shortest number of words as possible.
Yep.
So it's stripped of any personality, but that's for a reason, because the policymaker is short on time and needs to get the gist immediately. So you have the first sentence or two to say your main point. Whereas with this, I had a lot of leeway to put lots of emotion in the book, lots of drama, lots of terror. And incidentally, they turned it into an audiobook, and I was listening to it the other day and thinking, well, that's pretty intense.
Yeah.
Like I said, don't read it before bed. Might not be able to sleep.
Were there veteran stories in there that just, look, you've got a storyline, right? And you've got 300 pages, and this is not all going to fit. You got 50 something dudes. It's just not all going to fit. But is there another book there, or what do you do with those other scraps, or are they just left to the family? Like, here's what we've got. That's it.
I'm glad you asked that. What I did was I cut about a third of the manuscript out. Actually, it was 180,000 words. Looking back, I don't know why and how I did that, but I got it down to about 104 at the time. I got a book deal. What I did was I took the cutting room floor material, and I'm starting to post stories that didn't make it into the book on my website, microcroissant.com. There's a tab there on the menu for a blog. If you go there, you'll see some of the stories I cut, and I'll be adding things, so they're not all out there yet. I treat the blog and the website in general as sort of the extras on a DVD or Blu-ray. It's meant to enhance your experience with the book. So I would suggest reading the book first and then checking out the website. There's video. There's a lot of photos that I wasn't able to use in the book, period documents, period photos, some photos I've taken over the years, and some of the sort of during and after the war accounts of some of the key characters. Lots of stuff on the website. And thanks, Pete, for posting that.
Yeah. I think we'll check that out, you guys. And so is there anything on another media level, a documentary, movie, anything like that anyone approached you on, or are we still too early in the process with the book?
I think we're still early. I still don't even have any data on how sales have gone. But, maybe you're asking the wrong guy, but I think it would be well suited to a miniseries. I think a 2-hour movie would be challenging given the number of characters there are, but a miniseries would be tremendous. I didn't mention it yet, but there's a crew that landed in or near a concentration camp after they parachuted out. So that entire story is wild. What happens to them? They're taken inside and abused. There's the story of Dale Shabilsky, who I mentioned earlier, was captured and tortured by the Soviets, and many, many more. There's a lot of villainy on the part of hardcore Nazis on the Austrian side. A man was ordering Austrian soldiers and police to murder any airmen who were captured. Things like that. There's plenty of material for an awesome miniseries, if I may say.
Sounds like it, yeah.
Did you get a chance? I know you said you added some of the Austrian voices. Were you as fortunate to find people in Austria or in the surrounding area that knew of this attack?
Knew of this what? I'm sorry?
Knew of the attack, like the mission overhead. Did you were able to find people who were the European side of the story?
I did. I mentioned earlier, I talked to Anna and a couple of other people who were taking shelter. Believe it or not, I talked to a member of the Hitler Youth. This was a young man who was, by compulsion, made to join the Hitler Youth. And at age 15, he was, his entire high school class of boys was drafted into the Luftwaffe. And they were manning the anti-aircraft guns around Linz. I spoke to him on the 80th anniversary of the beginning of World War II in his home in Austria. He described what it was like to be, mercilessly indoctrinated with Nazism, what it was like, they had no hearing protection and they're firing these large 88 millimeter guns. Unfortunately, he passed away just a couple of months ago. I talked to another young man. There was a group for people too young to join the Hitler Youth. He was compelled to join that one. And for whatever reason, there was no school in Austria the day of the raid. So he was out playing with his buddies in a town in rural Austria. And one of the bombers came apart right over his village, and he was the second one on scene. So I interviewed him, and I interviewed 2 men on the bomber. I was doing research in a museum in rural Austria and came across this photo. It's a photo of the tail end of the bomber where it essentially snapped off and landed upright next to a structure. I didn't know where that structure was, but I met this museum in Austria, and they have the same copy of the photo that I have. And the curator sees me looking at it, and he says, "I know where that is." So I
Wow.
turned to my Austrian guide, and we kind of, without even having to say it, agreed to go check it out. So we hop in the car and reach this village that probably looks the exact same way as it does then, and it looks the same way now as it did then. We pulled over and just randomly started talking to an Austrian fellow and showed him the photo. And he says, I know exactly where that is. So he hops in the car. Within about 2 minutes, we're at this house. And the structure in the old photo is still there today. Matched it up perfectly. The Austrian family who now lives at the site where the bomber fell invited us in. They have a copy of the photo in a frame at the front door.
Jeez.
So it gets better, and I could talk about this stuff for hours, but the man who led us to the site says, you know what? I know a man who saw it happen. So he takes off and he brings back this young man that I just spoke of, who was, I believe, 11 years old that day. And he told us the bomber circled and came apart. And, it was incredible. And believe it or not, the next door is another house, but this house is abandoned, and in the backyard is a tire from that B-17. So I cut a piece off for a souvenir and came away with a great story, hopefully.
Yeah.
That's
cool.
the importance of if you get a chance to walk in the footsteps, so to speak. I always try to do that with my research, if possible, to walk in the footsteps of the things that I'm writing about. And you were very blessed to be able to do that and found great material. I mean, beyond great. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I did research in 4 countries. I guess I shouldn't count America, but I went to Italy to visit my uncle's old base. I went to Croatia to visit an emergency landing field that was in operation that day and many bombers landed at. And I went to, of course, Linz a couple of times. So, I'm the kind of guy who likes to roll up the sleeves and get out there and get dirty. And it really enriched the book, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What's next for you? I mean, I know you just got this book done by trying to sell this book, but surely you're working on something else, because I know that's what you do.
I've got a lot of ideas. I've always been fascinated with the Battle of the Falaise Pocket or the Falaise Gap, depending on how you want to call it. This was the culminating battle in the Normandy campaign. I've been doing research on enough for about a year. I don't know if I'll do anything with it because, once I wrote this book and got it published, it's so personal to me, and it's very special. And I know that the door has closed on doing that again with any other battle. The men are now, those who are still alive are in their late 90s at this point or older. So I can't answer that yet. I do love to tell stories and write. So something will probably come out of these typing hands. I don't know what, but maybe in fiction, maybe nonfiction, but we'll see.
Ron, any final questions? I don't want to take too much of Mike's time, but what do you want to get into now?
No, I think there's so much. I think you said this earlier, Pete. There's so much about World War II that we really don't know. We think we know, but Mike has just proven. When you dig into the grassroots, and of course it was a moment in time where he was able to visit with 55 men that were there, and then the people in Austria, and but I sure hope he does some more with World War II, because I think there's even though people are gone. I mean, this is what I do. I've done some books on the Alamo, so 1836, they're all gone, but there's still there's always fertile ground to plow with history, and I think he would be able to bring that to life, even if you'll never have that experience like you had in this one. That's a once in a lifetime. And I thank you for writing it, because wow.
Yeah, seriously.
I mean, seriously, yeah. I mean, what a treasure.
Thank you. And I'll just add this. I visited my uncle's grave in 2012 and pledged to tell a story, not knowing any of what would follow, not really knowing much at all. I had some of the letters and some of the other stuff, but just telling him that, I promise you, Uncle, I'll tell your story.
Yeah.
And just last weekend, I visited his grave and I left a copy of the book there. Mission accomplished. It was an emotional visit. It almost goes without saying, but I told him I was sorry that that had happened to him. He should have been a guy that was my favorite uncle and that was telling me stories, but all things happen for a reason. I left the book and I thanked him, and I told him that I hope he finds peace. So
good stuff, man.
Really blessed to do this, and I'm in touch with many family members at this point. We had a reunion this past April 25th, just a couple of days ago, was the 79th anniversary of the mission. So got together with family members of my uncle's crewmates, as well as the Roger the Lodger crew. We had several families from there. So the sons and the daughters and the nephews and everyone got together and, enjoyed a ball game. We were at Wrigley Field and spent some time getting to know each other. So it was a blessing. And next year, knock on wood, I'll be doing the 80th anniversary at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and we'll have a bigger crowd. So we'll see. But
let me know. I'll try to go. I'll try to join you. I'll try to come
I do have a commitment to be there for the 80th. So hopefully it will happen.
Let me roll the credits and I'll come back. We'll say goodbye to you. Hold on one sec.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly.